Dāmas un kungi, esiet sveicināti seminārā Telpiskās un citas eksperimentālās statistikas jaunākās metodes, kuru organizē Centrālās statistikas birojas un Pasaules banka sadarbībā ar Eiropas komisiju un Latvijas universitāti. Tā kā semināra darba valoda, sveicieni arī tiem, kas skatās tiešraidē. Labdien! Tā kā semināra darba valoda būs angļu valoda, es tagad pārslēgšos uz angļu valodu, bet ja kādam ir nepieciešams tulks, tāds ir pieejams, tātad lūdzu, jūs varat atrast viņu, kur tur aizmugurē, un ir iespējams arī tulkojums ir nepieciešams. I'll now switch to English. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the seminar Advanced Methods for Small Area and Other Experimental Statistics, which is being organized by the Central Statistical Bureau of Latvia and the World Bank Group in cooperation with the European Commission and the University of Latvia. My name is Paul Rodseps. I am the moderator for this seminar for the next 5 hours. But first, before we start our presentations, I'd like to hand this off to the people who will start off the seminar, to the organizers, and the first speaker will be João Pedro Azevedo from the World Bank. Mr. Azevedo, please.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to start by thanking, those are just very short opening remarks. I just want to thank you all for being here with us. It's a great privilege for us in the World Bank to be able to have had the opportunity, or to have the opportunity to be working with the Latvia Bureau of Statistics on this agenda. It has been a long road and a long process, and we thank very much Martins, Uldis, Sanda for all the support that you've given us in this area. There have been many kind of back and forth from the legal agreement in order for us to be able to work with you on this data until now, and numerous emails being sent and files being revised given the confidentiality of the access to the census. I think we are in a very interesting place in terms of results. It's very exciting to be able to have this 2-day seminar with you, in which we'll be learning from what you're doing, as well as being able to share a bit of our experience with Latvia and our experience in other countries in the European Union and beyond on the area of small area estimation, especially when it comes to the policy use. So once again, thank you very much for being here with us, and we're looking forward to a very productive discussion for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Azevedo. And next, a few introductory words from Mrs. Aija Žīgure, the President of the Central Statistical Bureau of Latvia. Mrs. Žīgure.
My voice here?
Yeah, vajadzētu būt ieslēgta.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to address you in this modern premises of the University of Latvia that, to my mind, are embraced with aura of knowledge, and that especially exerts additional influence on emerging of new ideas. One of the seminar goals is defined as follows: to discuss future research methods and facilitate use of experimental statistics for public policy analysis and decision making. We live in a rapidly changing world. Statistical data users become more and more educated and demanding. Tasks of statisticians in practice also become more and more complicated. Users demand statistical data on new indicators, on difficult to measure indicators, on sensitive indicators. They demand also data which are important, but with existing methods, not always it is possible to obtain good quality data. This is where a term experimental statistics appears. Now, already for some time, challenges and opportunities around experimental statistics is on the statistician's agenda. But still there are discussions whether statisticians must be involved in it. We in Statistics Latvia also discussed whether experimental statistics will be understood correctly by users, how to disseminate these data, what to do if it turns out that experimental data are not sufficient quality. We need well-educated and trained data users to make the best use of experimental data to make sure that these data are well explained and well understood. I highly appreciate the possibility to welcome you all in the seminar, Advanced Methods for Small Area and Other Experimental Statistics. High-level professionals will present results of their work that will be possible to be used for measuring quality of life of the population, inequality, and welfare. You represent different user groups, and I hope that you will get a useful information on new data production and analysis methods. You will have a possibility to assess the benefits of experimental statistics and discuss possible development trends. I thank World Bank experts for the initiative and support in the organization of this seminar. My greatest thanks to the Latvian University for hospitality and support. I am grateful to the seminar moderator, Pauls Rauceps, for the involvement. I would express my gratitude also to Martin Schliberts, who linked datasets for the World Bank project. I recognize efforts made also by other CSB colleagues who were involved in the organization of seminar. Have an interesting day, full of new conclusions and knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Žigure. I think it was very significant that Mrs. Žigure pointed to the experimental nature of the work that you're doing and the fact that it's tied with research, and that also ties in with the place we're in, the fact that we're in this new building of the University of Latvia that is specifically dedicated to research and experimentation, and so I think we're in a very, good environment to promote the kind of discussion that we'll be having about statistics as well. Now we'll be moving on to the presentations. The structure of the seminar is that we'll have a presentation, then there will be time for a few questions afterwards. There'll be a coffee break after the first two presentations, and at the end, we'll have a longer period where we can have discussions and questions regarding the issues that have been raised. Our first presenter will be Mr. Azevedo, who you've already met from the World Bank, and he will be talking about using poverty mapping to inform policy design, monitoring, and evaluations, and the possibilities for the Latvia poverty mapping. Please, Mr. Azevedo.
Thank you very much. There's a pointer here. Let me see if I can figure out how to make it work. And compress. No, I don't think we need this. Okay. Okay, so we can always ignore. Very good. Yes. So let me just see if this is this something that I can use to move the, or is more of a pointer, or neither one, or maybe I have to turn it on. Just, oh, I have to turn it on. It does. Okay. So gradually, I am figuring out. Okay, there's a noise. Okay, that's not it. Okay. Okay, I think I did. Sorry, it took me a little while. We're not as advanced at the World Bank as you are. So it's so the learning has started for us at least. So thank you very much once again for having given us the opportunity to be learning with you today and tomorrow. We'll look very much forward the discussion and the exchange. And basically, I think we would like to start by sharing a little bit our perspective in the bank on how efforts such as the use of the production of small area estimation can be used to inform policymakers. I think that's ultimately the objective of these 2 days. And I would like to start maybe by the final messages, if you allow me. So I think that the 3 takeaways that I would like you to leave, at least to have in your mind as part of this first presentation, are the following, right? So producing a poverty map is not an end itself, right? It's the beginning of a process. So we're not doing this for the sake of the, our intellectual curiosity. We're thinking and approaching this as a way to actually create information and data that can be used by policymakers. In that respect, I think that the words of the Madam President are very, very welcome. I think that brings a huge responsibility in terms of the quality of this information, and we need to be prudent and aware in terms of what are the standards that and the recommendations that we need to give to users when this data is shared or when this information is shared. I think that a second important aspect of this is that in the world that we live in, there's a significant number of additional data sets, both administrative and also more and more the so-called big data type of data that are used and produced as we interact in many different ways that can be used to augment the value of what we'll be talking here today. And I will be sharing with you some examples of how countries in the European Union have been using some of that by combining the information of the poverty map with other administrative records as well as big data, especially remote sensing, the satellite generated information to basically inform policymaking. And one last message is that a lot of what we'll be showing today and tomorrow, it's going to be focused on poverty, but the reality is that the same method can be used for a range of other indicators, right? We can use this for unemployment, we can use this for taxes. As a matter of fact, we'll be showing a little bit how to use this for cost of living, for prices, rental values of properties, as well as different subcomponents of the income aggregate. Right, so income before transfers and after transfers, which in the context of the assessment of social programs can be of extreme value. So it's a long range of topics that we want to share with you and cover. It's going to be lots of maps, so hopefully we'll move rather rapidly. And we want very much to have sufficient time for questions and comments throughout the session. I would like to start by just giving a bit of the context and the background of this collaboration between the World Bank, the European Commission, and the Latvian Bureau of Statistics. So this work started maybe a couple of years ago in the context of the EU Regional Development and Social Cohesion Funds. So DG Regio has approached the World Bank and asked if we could collaborate on how to transfer some of the know-how that the bank had developed over the years on the production of small area estimation for poverty to the context of the EU member states. Part of the idea was precisely to understand the granularity and the spatial distribution of the poor within member states. There is over 25% of the EU population that lives at risk of poverty, so that's 124 million people, and the EU has funds that are allocated in part through a targeting or with an objective to help mitigate the hardship that those families face. And part of the idea was to, how can we basically help the understanding of the spatial distribution of this population, keeping in mind that as the official statistics, given the limitations of the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, the SILC, which is the official survey to basically monitor the social and welfare among European countries, it's only representative at NUTS 2 or NUTS 1, depending on the country, right? So we wanted to be able to go beyond that. So, and of course, use this to basically help inform eventually budget cycles and allocation of resources within the EU and subnational programs. So this has been very much a partnership between the World Bank and the Commission. And within the Commission, we've been interacting primarily with DG Regio, but also DG Employment and Eurostat.
So this has been very much kind of what have been the main objectives of the work. I think the primary one was to produce poverty maps at NUTS 3 or below. And below we've been using what we call an augmented LAU2. So, and by augmented, what it means is that for many countries, the largest cities, we were able to basically break it down at a level below the traditional LAU2. And this is the case in Latvia as well, and probably Martin and Will tomorrow will be talking more about that. This has been very much a two-phased approach, in which the first one, we validated the methodology using data from both Denmark and Slovenia. Why these two countries? Well, because in those two countries, they actually have a continuous administrative-based census, right? And part of the idea was precisely to apply the small area estimation in a country in which we wouldn't need small area estimation in order to understand the spatial distribution of poverty, and basically compare the results of both approaches. So compare the small area estimation results with what is, let's say, the truth, right, that comes out of administrative records. And the results there were extremely encouraging, hence the second phase, which was to then move into the estimation of such small area estimates for actual, with a number of other countries. Now, in the division, the way it was kind of worked out is that DG Regio basically established two partnerships, one with the World Bank and another with the consortium of universities. So part of the member states were done with this consortium of universities, part was done through the World Bank in partnership always with the national statistical agencies. And for us, one of the primary objectives is to transfer this technology and learn from you and make sure that, you know, once this process is over, you're able to run such estimations by yourself, which in the case of Latvia, I think we're going to see in a little bit, you guys are already running with it. So it's very exciting for us. I think what is the challenge? Well, basically the challenge that we face, or the value proposition of this work, is that, well, we have two very important data sources. One is the survey of income and living condition, which is great in terms of the diversity of indicators, but it has the challenge that the sample size, it's not, it's limited, and it's only representative, at either NUTS 1 or NUTS 2. On the other hand, we have the census, which is a census, so the 100% coverage or something close to it, and but it doesn't have a very extensive questionnaire. And among the limitations, one of the major ones is information on either consumption or income, because those tend to be very costly to be collected. So it would be just unfeasible to try to collect consumption or income in a census effort. I think some of you are certainly familiar with the consumption questionnaire or an income questionnaire. For those of you that are not, just try to, report, your earnings from different sources, or everything that you consumed in the last 15 days or 30 days. You're going to quickly realize that it's not a trivial effort, and to try to submit the entire population of a country through that, it just wouldn't be feasible. So the value proposition of this work is very much to combine the strengths of both sources of information, the survey and the census, to have something that is bigger than those parts, which is basically the small area estimation, in which basically we use statistical modeling to simulate the variable of interest, or in this case welfare, but it could be unemployment, it could be basically food consumption, it could be expenditure on health, or a range of other things on the census, right? And on the methods, I think we'll have more time to discuss this in a later presentation and tomorrow as well. So I'm not going to dwell too much in the details. So what do we learn from it, right? So this is basically our current understanding of the territorial distribution of poverty among EU member states, right? Looking at NUTS 2. So this is a map of the EU using the national official poverty map of each and every one of the countries, which, just to remind, The definition of the population at risk is 60% of the median on each one of those countries, right? And here we have the range. So it goes from 4.6% to 56.8%. And of course, this is a thematic map, so we have brackets here. And this is the picture that we have at NUTS 2, or NUTS 1, depending on the country, right? With the work of this Moyer estimation, we were able to basically create this map, right? Which now basically looks at the EU and NUTS 3. Now, of course, Latvia, we still need to update the breakdown that we have there, in Estonia as well. But this is basically the first layer, right, which is understanding NUTS 2, which, of course, as you can imagine, the range of poverty already increases, right? So now we go up to 70%. And in some countries, we were able to go further down and all the way to Lao 2. So this is what we understand, right? So it's kind of, breaking down the NUTS 3 in Lao 2s, or this augmented version of Lao 2s. Now, we often try to say in the bank that, a poverty map is much more than a pretty picture. A lot of times my sense is that it's a very busy picture as well, because there's a lot of colors and very hard to identify patterns. So a lot of times what we're doing is using this Moyer estimation to produce what we call hot and cold spot analysis, right? So create local indicators of spatial association. And this is an example of that, right? So we're using this Moyer estimation to identify what are the spatial patterns of poverty in a particular locality on the basis of this indicator, and through that, basically classify territories either as poverty hotspots or poverty cold spots, or areas in which, the poverty doesn't seem to be statistically significantly different from the average. And we can get more into the methodology, but basically this is the result that we get in NUTS 2 and NUTS 3. And just by drilling it to one level below, you can see that some of the patterns, we start learning some new things, right? So for example, in NUTS 2, we don't identify the hotspot in Northern Ireland, neither the one in Eastern, or in Germany, or in the Eastern Poland, right, and former Eastern Germany. While the moment we actually move into a NUTS 3, those spatial heterogeneities emerge. And there's certainly a lot more nuance that we're able to find in Europe, in Southern Europe as well. So this is part of the value proposition of this work, right? So as we are able to move from NUTS 2 to NUTS 3, we are able to identify spatial patterns that before were hidden to us. Now, you could ask, so can you show now the Lao 2? And I won't be able to do that, and the reason is very simple. It is very dangerous to actually mix or to run these methods when you have some countries in one classification, territorial classification, and others in a very different one, because the size matters in this. So the moment if we break down and mix a Lao 2 with a NUTS 2 map, or NUTS 3 with Lao 2 maps, some of the patterns could be highly misleading. But for Latvia itself, it is possible to do that, and I think we'll show some of that tomorrow. So how can this work be used for policy, right? So one example is on the design, right, of policy. And here is an example again of the Lao 2 poverty estimates of Croatia, right? In this case here, I believe it's the income one. No, this is the consumption poverty map. So bear with me, you're going to be hearing a lot about Croatia today. I've been working in Croatia for the last year precisely on the policy use of this work. So there's a lot of what I find it potentially interesting examples that are coming from that part of the world. So I'll be sharing them with you. So but a lot of this I believe can be done in Latvia as well. So that's I think the interesting part of this. So here's basically what we've been working with the Ministry of Regional Development in Croatia, as well as the Ministry of Social Policy and the Croatian Bureau of Statistics. And there basically the idea is that once we've done the poverty map, and there we were able to do it both on income and consumption, right? So we've done the income that you have it in Latvia, but we were also able to produce the one using the consumption measure of poverty. We were able to produce the hotspots of poverty in Croatia in order to inform the policy, right? And you can see that Croatia basically is split in three parts: the eastern, the west Adriatic coast, where you have tourism, and certainly an area that it doesn't stand out. And from a policy point of view, I think one of the lessons that we're taking is that using the hotspots often make a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to communicate for policymaking, but also it minimizes some of the risks of over-interpreting these very individual poverty rates, which we all know have measurement error around them. So it's better to kind of identify what are the big patterns, spatial patterns of the phenomena that we're interested in, to focus on a particular point estimates. I think another aspect of work that it can be done is a simulation of how much more bang for the buck or poverty reduction could we get if we improve the spatial targeting of our, let's say, public spending, right? So this is a thought exercise that we've done for Croatia, and it can be done for Latvia, in which, let's say, we have 0.5% of GDP of Croatia, and we wanted to basically distribute to the population through some kind of cash transfer or program. And they're basically, but we don't know who the poor are in the country, right? So there are basically 4 ways we could do that. One is that we distribute this uniformly across the entire population of the country. So everybody, we take this 0.5% of GDP and we give it equally to everybody in the country. And that's our baseline, or value of reference here, 1. Okay. A second exercise is that, well, no, wait a second. We have the silk, and the silk tells us, what proportion of poor live on each one of the nuts too of the country. So what we're going to do with this money is that we're going to actually distribute it proportionally to where we know the poor are. So if we know that 70% of the poor live in region A and 30% in region B, we're going to take 30% put in region B, 70% put in region A, right? And what happened and then within those regions, we're going to give the money uniformly, the same amount to everybody, because, let's say we don't have the resources to do better in terms of targeting. And then you can see here that, your poverty rate basically goes lower 5%, your poverty gap gets lower with the same amount of money by just improving the targeting criteria, using geography as a criteria. The poverty gap, which is the distance that people are on average from the poverty line, it's 10% higher, and the poverty gap square, which is that distance square, goes up by 15%. And then, of course, we can use NUTS 3 and LAO 2, right? And this is the point, right? So by bringing in geographical information, right, you can significantly improve the targeting of your public spending by just using that information, nothing else. Now, this is just a thought exercise. We know that this day and age, you have a lot more data that you can use to improve your targeting, but the point here is that knowing where the poor are can matter significantly when it comes to the impact on poverty reduction, right? I mean, just to give an example, if we use the Croatian poverty map at LAO 2, we can actually double the impact of the same amount of resources, right, in terms of the FGT2 or the poverty severity of the country, right, by just using that information. And within that LAO 2, everybody gets the exact same amount. So it's a potentially very powerful information, which also, it's not that costly to be produced if we assume that the quality is sufficiently good. Now, of course, I think a lot of the value of this comes from exploring the heterogeneity, right? And this is another example from Croatia, in which basically we show that in this particular NUTS 3 region, right, we have here the distribution of the poverty rate of all municipalities or LAO 2s in Croatia, and we can see that in some of these localities, right, we do find municipalities across the entire distribution of poverty rates of the country, right? To make the point that, a lot of times when we're thinking of the world at a NUTS 1 or NUTS 2, we tend to think of large homogeneous areas. And when we start drilling it deeper, what we do find is that even in relatively poor areas, there's a lot of variation. And that variation can be extremely powerful when it comes to the design of policies, because what a lot we can do better is to learn from places that are doing better than others, right? Within the same locality. I think this is another example of using tax data as well as ethnical information for Hungary, in which basically we're able to overlay the two types of data to create basically this hotspot analysis, again, of both, how the distribution of the Roma population and tax incomes are related with poverty. There are some exercises that can be done, such as ex-ante simulations of potential policies that might be of interest to a particular country. And this is just an example in which basically we look at the expansion of internet access. So we pick up 2 municipalities in Croatia, here they are, and we decide to do a shock, right? So one of them has 19% of internet penetration, another one has 70% of internet penetration, and the exercise is basically to increase internet penetration by 25%. Now, what we find is that if we do this in Zagreb, right, the poverty rate would go down. I mean, the impact would be a 3.2 percentage points reduction in the poverty rate. What it's interesting is the radius and the externality of that impact. If we do the same thing in the locality that has a much lower penetration of this particular service, right, we find not only a larger impact in terms of poverty reduction on that locality itself, but also a much larger spillover effect of that, right? Again, this is just a very simple simulation in which we're not attributing causality here, but it's just a thought exercise that we could be doing it ex ante any policy in order to understand what are the expected impacts that we could find if we use this information. Right, and a lot of this is information that we have readily available, because what we're doing here is combining the poverty map with the information that we have from the census regarding, let's say, internet penetration in the context of Croatia. Now, what about policy monitoring, right? So there, in Croatia in particular, what we've been working with them is in the construction of this index of multiple deprivation, right? Which basically it's a multidimensional indicator that captures, in order to identify lagging regions in the country following this conceptual framework, which was basically produced together with different line ministries in the country, right? So this conceptual framework is not ours, it was something that was constructed with the Croatian line ministries, in which basically they were interested to identify lagging regions and think of their regional policy in terms of the economic, social, and the service pillars. And within each one of those, there are sub-domains, and for each one of those domains, there are individual indicators that were produced using administrative records from the line ministries. Part of the objective of this work is for the different line ministries that are working towards improving the living standards of the lagging regions to be able to work together, sharing a similar framework. So we wanted by design build on indicators that could be, that were actually constructed and obtained from each one of those, from the administrative records of each and every one of the different line ministries, such as labor, education, social policy, finance, planning, so on and so forth, as well as the Bureau of Statistics, the Croatian Bureau of Statistics. Now, of course, when you're doing this type of exercises, one of the first issues that one faces is, okay, what are the criteria to select indicators, right? And that's where the poverty map proved to be extremely valuable, right? Because what we did in the context of Croatia was to use the results of the poverty map that we had for them in order to identify the indicators and that were of most value for the purpose of the exercise. And once we've done that, basically we basically trimmed we came to this particular set of indicators here, 31. And part of the way we are using the IMD is precisely by looking at both the poverty dimension and the multi-deprivation dimension simultaneously, right? So each one of these dots here is allowed to in Croatia, right? And part of the idea is that we have municipalities that have, let's say, above median poverty rate, monetary poverty, which is this value, and are, let's say, below the median multiple deprivation index, which, and this would be, let's say, the priority municipalities in this quadrant here, right? I think part of the value of this is that we are understanding more and more that poverty is multidimensional and it's not just monetary, right? So we need to think of this in terms of a multidimensional indicator. Now, one of the advantages of the IMD is because it's produced out of administrative records, we can update it a lot more frequently than the poverty rate or than the poverty map. And so that gives us the possibility to monitor the policy as well as do a diagnostic. Now, I think one of the issues that we're able to do is this quadrant analysis, right, which will depend very much on the cutoff. And I can get more into the methodology and the intrinsicacies, but it's just to give you a sense, right, of how the poverty map can be used when combined with other indicators. If we didn't have the poverty map, it would be very hard to produce these indicators because we wouldn't know what were they correlated with, right? I mean, we could make assumptions that some of these things were good, some of them were bad, but in reality, we wouldn't know, right? Because we have the poverty map, it's very clear, there's a very clear and evident relationship that we can establish and we can communicate within the government. Now, one of the values, of course, is that we can identify areas of the country that have a similar index of multiple deprivation, but very different levels of monetary poverty. The same way we can identify places that have the same monetary poverty, but very different levels of multidimensional deprivation. And that's part of the value of this exercise, because once you do that, you can actually explore this heterogeneity, right? And the way we explore this heterogeneity is through this municipal scorecard, right? So here we've just selected 5 municipalities. Each column is a municipality. And here are the domains, subdomains, and indicators. And we can see here, the way we've done this is using an anchored relative index, right? So we've anchored the relative value of these indicators in 2011, because that's the poverty map year, right? And the way you interpret each one of these numbers is that in 2011, 90% of the municipalities were better than this municipality in this particular indicator, right? And population density is one of the things that the government wants to improve in the context of Croatia, right? And if we take proportions of students falling the Matura exam, in 2011, only 32% of the municipalities of the country were better than this one, right? And this is a tool that basically in Croatia, the Ministry of Regional Development is quite excited because they can use to try to bring some focus into some of the discussions with members of parliament and members of municipalities in terms of how resources can and should be better allocated, right? Because you can create this municipal scorecard and have a very kind of objective conversation of why maybe certain policies should be done in certain localities and not in others. And of course, you can group this by domains of analysis, which can also be of use, because not everywhere, we don't need the same policies everywhere, right? Some places might need policies that are towards physical infrastructure, while others might need fiscal policies, others might need to be worried about health, education, or demographics, right? So that heterogeneity also comes in out of this exercise. And again, it is also linked with the notion of monetary poverty, which came from the poverty map to begin with. So as you can see, I'm still struggling with the PowerPoint, the buttons here, but hopefully it will get better. So another interesting exercise that we can do with this, once we have this index, is that we can actually identify outliers, right? So I talked a little bit earlier about the idea of the hotspots. So within that framework, another thing that we can do, and now we are not on the poverty space, we are on the IMD space, this index of multiple deprivation, and there, because the indicators they come from administrative records, right? We don't have the problem of the measurement error that we would have with the poverty map, right? But in the space of the IMD, what we can do is we can find not only on the level, let's say, what are the localities that have a low IMD but are in the middle of a hotspot of IMDs, right? So let's say they are surrounded, municipalities that have a good IMD but are surrounded by areas with a bad IMD, right? Or the opposite, right? Municipalities that have, let's say, a low IMD but are surrounded by places that have a high IMD. And part of the idea is, well, maybe we should go to these places and understand what makes them different, right? Instead of kind of, we go to places where we know that maybe there is something there that sets that place apart, and we have all the data to understand if this is very evident from the data, what sets them apart, or we can actually have structured interviews, we can actually have focus groups, we can use mixed methods to actually try to understand what is happening there. And we can do that on the level, but we can do that on the change as well, right? So here, let's say, are areas in which in red, the IMD has increased a lot. In blue areas, the IMD has increased a lot in between 2009 and 2015. Sorry, it's not 11 here, it's 15. So between 2011 and 2015, we have areas in which there were changes in the IMD. Some places improved a lot, some places it actually fell, but then you had outliers on both ends, right? And again, we can use the same approach to kind of drill deeper and understand what maybe drove those differences. And through that, learn in order to basically design regional policies that can actually leverage those characteristics, right? And that's kind of the approach that we are taking there. Now, in terms of evaluation, this is an example of some work that we're also doing there with the Ministry of Social Policy, in which basically we've created a hotspot of the poverty rate before transfers, as well as the hotspot of the proportions of municipalities that receive a particular social transfer, right? And what we're doing is overlaying the two, right? So let's say, ideally, what we would like is that the hotspots in poverty are also receiving resources, are also the hotspots on where the Ministry of Social Policy is actually devoting those resources, right? And if those hotspots coincide, they are what we call a green area over here, that we don't need to worry about it, right? On the other hand, if an area is a cold spot of resources, so it's not getting much resources from the Ministry of Social Policy, but it's also a cold spot of poverty, that's also a light green area. We don't need to worry about that because, there's alignment in terms of the allocation. But then there are the orange and the yellow, which are the places where maybe we need to pay attention, which are these areas over here, because they are a hotspot in poverty, but they are not a hotspot on the transfers, right? On the other hand, you have some areas which are cold spots on poverty, but are showing up as receiving more resources than or actually the yellow one. They are hotspots in poverty, but they are not receiving any of the money, right? Or they're not a hotspot in terms of the transferring of the resources. So those would be the areas that maybe the Ministry of Social Policy would need to understand what is happening to their social centers over there, what maybe are the patterns, or if there are any, if it's an issue of staffing, or is it an issue of the nature of or the characteristics of the poverty in those localities that are probably not well covered by the existing design of policies, so on and so forth. So you can have a structured conversation about those differences. And you can use the poverty mapping combined with the MIS, the Management Information System from the ministry, to basically understand this and try to improve. We can also do that in terms of the number of the poor and the number of beneficiaries. And there are some other methods that we can use, such as geographically weighted regressions, to look at the spatial correlation of these things. So basically, this is for those of you that are familiar with a linear regression, that looks at a correlation between two variables, and overall, but you can actually have models in which this correlation vary in space. Those are the geographically weighted regressions, and what we have here, what we are plotting here is what is the association of these two variables here, basically the number of poor and the number of beneficiaries over the space, right? And what we show here is that in blue, it means that there's a low correlation. In red, there's a high correlation, right? And that in itself can be used to have an informed conversation between the ministry and let's say potentially the Ministry of Finance, in terms of where resources are being well spent, where resources could be improved, or from, let's say, the central department of the ministry with its branches, in order to understand why some branches seem to be able to do better than others, right, in terms of tackling the observed poverty. So in terms of linking administrative records and big data, right, I think one area that we've been working, again, is using remote sensing. And I think we'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow on the population rasters. But here is an example of information that can be easily created out of satellite data, right? So we can, today, basically, there's algorithms that can identify roads even by quality. And once you have that information, basically, that comes out of, let's say, the Sentinel program that takes pictures, right? Every 45 minutes, every 6 days, we have new pictures of Latvia on a 10 by 10 meter resolution. So it's pretty detailed. And what we can do is create basically information on the road density of the country. And we can use that again to do, the hotspots, identify the areas in which the road density is good, places where road density is not as good, and then again correlate that with poverty, correlate that with the policies that we are interested in. Of course, there are other sources of data that we can use. I mean, some countries have unemployment benefits, and you can use the records from unemployment benefits from the Ministry of Labor in order to plot them. You can look at business registers and see how they are concentrated in space, and how is that correlated with again, poverty or measures of inequality. We can certainly look at data from the system of vital statistics. So we can look at mortality rate. In some countries, you have population registers, so you can look at dependency ratios as well and see, again, how these are correlated in space. You have, again, education, ministers of education. I'm not sure if in Latvia you have the matura exams, but some in the former Yugoslavian countries, they had that, and basically Ministry of Education gave us access to the test scores, right, of the students, and we were able to use those test scores to create, to improve our understanding of the spatial pattern of basically test scores in the country, as well as population with secondary education. And of course, for those, you can also do the outlier detection, right? So again, we can use this information, as I mentioned earlier, for other indicators. And here we have two quick examples, one on the realm of cost of living, and another one on sub-indicators of poverty. So I think part of and we are working with, in Latvia as well with you on how to replicate some of this work. But the idea basically is that we know that cost of living is not the same across the territory, and a lot of times that matters both in terms of migration flows as well as the design of certain interventions, right? So we can use data from the household budget survey or from the CELC itself to try to learn how those spatial costs of living might differ, right? One example from the CELC is to use the rent information that is reported in the CELC and use that to basically create a spatial deflator of cost of living on the base of rent. So this is an example of Croatia, of Romania now, in which basically we've created again, the hotspot analysis on how different is poverty before and after we spatially deflated. So in blue, we have the areas in which basically the cost of living is relatively low, and in the center, right, relatively higher. Now this is using food. Now one thing that is very important on this kind of exercise is that your source of deflator matters, right? And this is an example in which we're using basically a Pash index of the cost of food, right? And there basically what we're doing is using the unit value from the household budget survey in order to create this deflator. Now we can use other sources of data. I don't know if you have ever heard of something called Numbeo, which is a crowd sourcing effort in which over the internet they collect cost of living of many places in the world, including Latvia. But in Latvia they have it, I believe, 3 or 4 locations. In Romania they had 40 locations. So we've played with these locations and we created another poverty map using this source of data. Now one thing to keep in mind is that the previous map was only using food. In this one, we're using a bunch of other things, right? They're also looking at assets, they're looking at rent, they're looking at a number of other sources of information. And as you can see, the spatial pattern that emerges is very different. Of course, there's another exercise that we can do, which is to use just rent, right? So the CELC has this question about for how much would you rent, or for how much would you pay to rent a house like yours? Right, this information is imputed for both people that actually pay rent and people that don't pay rent. So there is already some treatment that is done on that variable in terms of the quality. So the advantage of that information is that it captures data on the quality of the property, right? So for Romania, we've used that data to do a small area estimation of that rental value throughout the whole country, and on the base of that, created a spatial deflator on housing costs. And with the understanding that housing is an important asset, probably the most important asset that any family will ever have. So using that, we found that in the context of Romania, clearly the large metropolitan areas had a higher cost of living than the more rural agricultural parts of the country. And of course, we've done this for Croatia as well. And then, of course, there is all the additional types of poverty maps that we can do. I mean, there is the consumption, right, based on income. The consumption based on expenditures from the household budget surveys. We can look at children, or poverty maps by population subgroups, such as children, the elderly, the working age. We can look at the working poor, right, which is an important concept in the context of the EU. So we can look at in-work poverty, both in the income space as well as in the consumption space. We can look at working age, right? So there's a range of different applications, right? And now I'm coming to my final set of results. So I think often when we're engaged in this kind of conversations, one question that people have is, well, okay, this is a poverty map of 2011. So would that be useful for policymakers in Latvia in 2017, right? What are you talking about, right? I mean, aren't you 7 years too late? or maybe 20 years too late, because what would really be useful to know is what would poverty look like in 10 years, so we could align policies to try to avoid getting there when the time comes. So that's a very important question, very, very valid. I think the best kind of way that I can think of answering that is by looking at the handful of places for which we have poverty maps over 20 years. And I will show a couple of places. So one is my home country. I'm Brazilian, right? So I had to find a way to put Brazil into the presentation, sorry. So here's poverty maps from 1991 all the way to 2010. Now, this is all on the same scale, and Brazil has had actually a massive reduction in poverty, right? Poverty went from 60% to 30% in 20 years. So there's absolutely no doubt that poverty went down, right? So that the level has changed, I think there's very little question. Now, I think the big question is, has the spatial pattern of this poverty changed over the same period of time? Well, again, we can do hotspots. Sorry, there's a certain pattern here, right? So this is basically the hotspots of poverty between 91 and 2010. And you might, those of you that can see this, you might say, oh, what is happening in the Amazon, right? There was no poverty here, no poverty here, and all of a sudden there's all these hotspots here in the Amazon as of 2010. Well, this is driven by methodology, right? Because until 2006, the Brazilian equivalent to the silk did not cover the rural population of the Amazon. It was only in 2006. So here, we didn't have data, right? This is actually the Amazon, the Manaus, which is metropolitan areas. And all of a sudden, we start getting data from the rural part of the Amazon. And of course, we are able to find poverty or not. But other than that, things kind of remain quite constant. And if we look in terms of where the poor it's concentrated, not in terms of the poverty rate, but where the poor are, right? These are the 8 large metropolitan areas that basically concentrated most of the poor of the country, right? So one thing that is very important and I think Will and Martin's probably going to show a bit of that, is that often we think of poverty in terms of the rate, but more important, or as important as the rate, is where the number of poor are, because often they can be very different, right? Actually, often the highest poverty rate places are not where most of the poor people are. Most of the poor are often concentrated in the lowest poverty places, namely the capitals of the cities, of the countries, right? Because that's where they find most of their economic opportunities. And I'm sure we find that in Latvia as well, and we'll show more of that tomorrow. And this is basically the pattern that we find in Brazil. Basically, if we had decided to allocate resources, on the basis of the poverty map of 1991, we wouldn't have misallocated any place. There were only a few additional cities that came out over the years. But all the hotspots of 91 were the same as 2010. And there were a handful of new ones, just because the population grew in some other parts of the country that we didn't expect, right? Now you can think, oh, this is Brazil, that's, developing country, has nothing to do, it's not, that interesting. Let's look at some other place. So let's bring the US, right, which is also has its own peculiarities, but basically this is 20 years of poverty in the US, right? Their poverty has not changed dramatically, right? It has remained relatively stable. Again, if we do the hotspots, you do find some changes, right? So this area here used to be, in Texas, used to be a hotspot and kind of gradually fitted out, but some of the other hotspots remain the same, and the cold spots also remain kind of the same. And the hotspots of where the poor are also, well, they've just grown, right? So southern Florida, right? It wasn't such a hotspot of the poor and now became, right? So, okay, this is all visual, right? So can you put some numbers on this? So this is basically the rank correlations of everything that I just showed you, right? And if you think about it, right, this is the Spearman correlation on the poverty rate. So between 91, in blue for Brazil, in orange for the United States. Brazil, we're using 5,500 municipalities. The US, we're using 3,000 counties. And what you can see is that in terms of the rate, you're still getting a correlating 20 years of 0.86 for Brazil, for the US, 0.86 as well, right? In 5 years or 10 years, you go 0.92, which is still pretty high, if you ask me. But if you do this correlation on the hotspot, right, actually the temporal correlation is even higher, right? We are above 9, almost 0.95, right, within a 20-year gap, right? So the reality is that it's really hard to change those spatial patterns, right? It is very hard, right? So there's a lot that you can still do for the next 20 years, or at least the next 10 years, if you believe in these maps, with the poverty maps that you have now created for Latvia, right? After all, of course, the due diligence that needs to be done. So this still has a pretty good shelf life. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the US map, let's see if I can, it's actually not done on the basis of a small area estimation, okay? This map here is done using the American Community Survey, the ACS, and there they actually do have a question on income. So, you know, this is actually the spatial pattern of the temporal correlation using actual data. The Brazilian one, we are using small area estimation. There are some links and there's this interactive dashboard which hasn't yet been launched, but the idea is that, you know, the DG region would like to certainly be able to have the Latvia numbers here as well once everything goes as planned. And just to kind of come back to my initial questions, right? I mean, this is just the beginning. I think that the most important part is to use this for policy, and there I think we have to think of how to communicate. I think what we are learning is that using this hotspot type of approach facilitates a lot of the communication and brings the focus on the spatial areas that have patterns that maybe deserve attention, instead of getting distracted by a bunch of little numbers that might actually not be that different at the end of the day and might all be within bounds of confidences of interval. I think there's a lot that we can do by augmenting this data with administrative records, and they can really help us to both identify or improve selectivity and prioritize public investment. And certainly the methods can be used for a range of other things, right, beyond poverty. And beyond income poverty, right? I mean, we can think of consumption-based poverty, we can look at food, we can look at non-food, we can look at rent, and a range of other things. So with that, thank you very much. My emails, if you have any questions, please just shoot an email, and we'll be here for the next 2 days. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Azevedo. That was an incredible presentation. A lot of information, a lot of very suggestive, rich maps that you presented. We have about 20 minutes for questions now, and so I think after watching this, I hope that a lot of people have ideas and questions about what similar things we could do here in Latvia with these kind of studies. Questions? Nothing like okay, please.
Responsible for the survey in Latvia, and first of all, thank you for your very interesting presentation. And I have a question about your last part about patterns of poverty. I mean that there is quite interesting situation in Latvia that we have some problems with age structure, and because of that, poverty rates. Excuse me, I will start. Poverty rates very for old persons very dramatically go up and down, and it's because of pensions are around poverty threshold. So it means that in our country you will see different patterns year by year. maybe not every year, but every 3 years. So it is a problem of Latvia, I think so. So you have to take it into account. Thank you.
Do you have a comment about
Yeah,
that?
should we get maybe a few and then, or
Okay.
I can react.
Yeah. You have another question? Maybe we could answer this one
Okay,
and then we'll
absolutely.
Yeah, if you could just, you have a microphone.
Yeah, so I think, is it working? Okay. So, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of this is context specific. The reality is that we don't have poverty maps for many countries over many years, right? Actually, there are relatively few countries that have done it more than once using a comparable methodology. So that's another, and this is part of the challenge, right? A lot of times countries do it twice, but each time they are 10 years apart, and the team developing is completely different, and they choose to do a different methodology, and as a consequence, they are not comparable. The examples that I showed were examples of, and there's actually Mexico is the other one, and Sri Lanka is another one, in which we actually know we have a comparable methodology over these 15 or 10 years, right? But I take very much your point, right? And of course, a lot of this is going to be always context specific. One thing that it would be interesting to think about it is if the consumption poverty map would be as volatile as the income poverty map, even for Latvia, right? Because if we believe in economic theory, right, consumption should be smoother than income. As a consequence, even the elderly would have strategies and coping mechanisms to basically be able to accommodate such shocks. So one thing that would be interesting to think about it is if doing a consumption poverty map wouldn't give a slightly different perspective. But your point on pensions, I mean, that's, I take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Walker, and I have some comments or questions or considerations. Of course, you use estimation of consensus data to make estimations. And what's your opinion? What kind of statistical impact it could be made on results? The second thing what I would like to mention is that in Social Protection Committee Indicator Subgroup we are discussing or testing several no-casting flash estimate methods. And the initial results of this testing process actually it shows that there is no straightforward method could be applied to use flash estimates, and in different countries appliance different methods gives totally different trends, and anyways there is some way how to validate this appliance of these methods, and how you considered when you making this exercise in poverty mapping, what could be alternative methods to validate these results of poverty mapping? Thank you.
So just one clarification, you said flash estimates? Oh, now casting. Now casting, okay, okay, now casting. Very good. Now casting, okay. Now, yeah. Now,
Yep, go ahead, yeah.
so I think inference is very important, right? Now, the reality is that, so one area that we are working is precisely figuring out how to test the robustness of the hot and cold spot analysis with the inference of the poverty map, right? So basically combining, because the hotspot analysis is in itself a test to statistics, right? Now, so there's no literature on how to do this and bring in the inference. We have some ideas that we are discussing with others. My prior, to be honest, is that the hotspot analysis will likely to be very robust to the standard errors of the small error estimation, which would then give us an even additional reason to think more in terms of hot and cold spots as opposed to specific point estimates which will be statistically, might or might not be of differences that are statistically significant. Now, the agenda on nowcasting is very important. I think that there is a bit of a there's a lot of interest on that. We are working on this as well. Some of the work we're doing is using remote sensing, so satellite imagery. And here, for example, Latvia would be probably a country in which there will be a lot of potential for that, because you have very good coverage and information is quite structured. So you're not talking about rural Africa, where land plots, and they are very hard to be identified, right? You have the GRC that with the Mars program collects a lot of data. You have the CAP, right, the Common Agricultural Policy, which I'm sure has very detailed information on land use in your country. So you have a lot of potential very interesting sources of data that you could use to do nowcasting. I think that how to validate these methods, and there's a friend who often say that you have to be very careful, because you want to do a map of the poor and not a poor map, right? So sorry, that was my only joke for the day. But it is one possibility is certainly to build on registers, right? And you do have in Latvia registers on income that you could use to triangulate and to validate. So I think it is possible to validate, and I think Latvia would be potentially, if not Latvia, some other EU member countries certainly are able to do it. Denmark and Slovenia are two that come to my mind because we've done it there. Not for nowcasting, but for the original poverty mapping work. But I also think that we have to think carefully, and I understand that in the context of Latvia, given your pension structure, right, it might be more relevant to nowcast very frequently. But a lot of times these things are not changing that frequently, right? And we also have to think in terms of what kind of social policies we want to create, right? Or what kind of policies do we want to create, right? Do we want to create more structural policies, or policies that are going to be reacting to very kind of, or policies that are going to be anti-cyclical, right? And then it depends on the existing infrastructure that you have, right? Ideally, you probably would want a combination of both. You want policies that are counter-cyclical, and you want more structural ones, but that will depend on what kind of unemployment registration system do you have, what kind of social protection management information system you have, what are the kind of programs that you have in place. Are these programs that were designed to be kind of rapidly deployed, or are they programs that are intended to be more structural, right? So depending on the type of policies that you have in place, it might make more or less sense to be kind of thinking a lot about the nowcasting. But I do think that there's a lot of potential with remote sensing, as well as administrative records, right? There's a lot that probably you can do bringing in administrative records, such as the caseload of unemployment benefit, the caseload of pensions or tax records, so on and so forth, and combining all of this. I'm sure you can at least in a place like Croatia, for example, just using the 31 variables that we've selected for the index of multiple deprivation, the IMD, you get an R-square of above 0.7, right? Which, if you believe it, right, it's a pretty good predictor of what is happening to poverty over time in the context of that country, right? So I think that the administrative records are also a very important source for you to be considered. But I'll be happy to talk more during the break.
If I could follow up with the moderator, the question the Ministry of welfare raised, I think, raises a broader question, which maybe you have experience in a number of countries. The methods you use are not simply sort of what your average person on the street thinks of as what the Statistical Bureau does, which is it goes around and counts and says, we know exactly that there are 1,952,385 people in Latvia, right? That's what they expect. You do a survey, and a lot of the stuff that you're doing is based on surveys and interpolations and extrapolations from that. How does that play out in politics and in convincing the population that the policies based on these measurements are in fact justified?
Mm-hmm. That's also a very interesting and useful question, right? Need to be careful with the analogy, right? Because if we all believe in weather forecasting, right?
I'm not sure.
but it's certainly not a very good analogy, right? So there is, some people say that all models are wrong, right? Some of them are useful, and I think that's the case, right? I mean, it's about the use, and it's about how we communicate. And I think again, I would go back to the issue of, probably what we want is to identify patterns, like broad patterns, as opposed to try to obsess on a specific number of a specific municipality, right? Because the challenge often that you have, and I've seen this play out in many countries, is that the moment you put, and that's the challenge with this kind of work, right? Which is that this is a number that has an address, right? It is a municipality, and that municipality has a political constituency, it has citizens, it has a voice, and the moment that you put this number out, right? Often what happens is that journalists go to the municipality that shows the poorest rate, and they go interview the mayor.
Yeah.
And the mayor tells you, of course I'm not the poorest, right? I know my municipality, and I know the 5 municipalities around here, and I will tell you that one over there is the poorest. It's not me, it's them. Yeah. And the last thing that we want, right, is for the number to become a distraction, right? And that's the risk. And I take that point very seriously, right? And that's why I think it is important to think in terms of ranges, brackets, or kind of hot spots and cold spots, right? I think it's a lot easier to communicate that, look, this region here seems to be systematically worse or lagging vis-a-vis that other part of the country, right? So that diffuses the conversation from a conversation of individual cases, right, that can lead nowhere, because everybody will feel that they are special and that they are different, and that number is not really their number, and it becomes a conversation about regions and patterns, right, and bigger and broader patterns. And I think that's certainly useful from a communication point of view, and bringing in ownership around the number. Of course, the process in which the number is created is also very important, right? So we need to be aware of that, and make sure that there are sufficient communication, and there is a communication strategy around the process, so on and so forth. But the reality is that if we think, just coming back to the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, right? The allocation of resources on the CAP are based on remote sensing, right? Which, to some extent, is about modeling, right? So they're not interviewing anybody. They're doing some modeling in terms of what is happening on the ground on the basis of pictures that, sometimes have good quality, sometimes they don't have good quality, and they have to make extrapolations on the basis of that data. Right? I mean, I don't know if there's anybody here today from national accounts, right? But I'm sure that in Latvia, you guys are very special, but in a lot of places, national accounts, there's a lot of assumptions that go into, and a lot of these are based on constructs. So a lot of the things that we are doing, right, are derived on constructs. We need them in order to be able to deal with the complexity of the world that we live in. I think the communication is very important, the process is very important, and the presentation, right? And kind of moving away from a single number to more kind of geographical patterns.
Okay. Question over there.
Okay.
And it's a little bit linked to the question of the colleague about pensions, which in Latvia are very close to 60% of equalized income.
Okay. So we are using the Eurostat, the European official poverty definition. So we are using 60% of the median. Now, of course, since we only have 1 year, right, it doesn't matter, right? We're only using, so it's 60% of the median of the survey year. So, which will be very close to the, in the case of Latvia, to the cutoff of the pensions that you were mentioning. But yeah, so we're using the official, and in Croatia is the same thing, right? And when we're doing consumption, we're also using 60% of the median consumption.
Okay. Yeah, here comes it.
Thank you, Ministry of Welfare. Thank you for the presentation. It actually gives us a very interesting picture for analysis, but I have to agree with the colleagues before me that the threshold is a very important point in all the exercise. And if you know a bit of Latvia, we have a very decentralized social assistance system where there is no unified national poverty line across the country. So in that sense, you would see very different measures and very different levels if you would take into account very different regulations on social assistance in more than 100 municipalities. And if not, then if you would play only with the Eurostat 60% threshold, then you would see a damaged picture, I would say. And the other comment or question from my side is you showed us a picture from Brazil, which had more than 20 years history with rather small changes in it. Do you have also comments on what were the policy measures that followed or didn't follow your initial pictures when you showed them in 2010? And if not, then you only have those pictures over time frame and no real policy measures following them. Then it's only an interesting tool to play with no real action after it. And it's not only on consumption and income. I think policy measures have also to do with environment, and it's a really good thing to start thinking what are the causes. Otherwise, we would only target more social assistance to the regions you see the highest hotspots, and that's it. But then you would not influence the behavior of the inhabitants in those regions. You have to see what are the causes and how do you influence the activation measures and the life pattern of them. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that so just to clarify, right? So this work, right, the work that we are doing here in Latvia is a partnership with DG Regio, and it has very specific terms of reference that were given to us by the Commission, right, which was to produce a poverty map using the official Eurostat poverty definition for the member states. And that's why we've used what we were asked to. I fully agree with you that, you know, and that's what we were able to do in Croatia, and that's why I've shown a lot of slides on Croatia, is that in Croatia we were able to tailor this work to the reality and to the specificities of both the Ministry of Social Policy as well as regional development. And through that, had a much more granular and kind of nuanced perspective. right? Which can take different shapes and forms depending on the country, right? In the context of Croatia, I mean, they wanted in a particular direction. In the case of Latvia, I think you've raised very valid points in terms of how the system, how the social protection system of the country is structured, the heterogeneity of your municipalities, of the fact that, you know, there are different thresholds and eligibility criteria in different parts of the country, and all of that could potentially be built in and be kind of, and this kind of could be, this kind of work could be the basis of something that is much more granular and tailored to the reality of Latvia. Now, I fully agree with you on the policy and the environment, and I think that, again, this is the beginning, not the end, right? I think that this kind of analysis needs to be complemented with information on where the social centers are, what are the rules of engaging, what are the types of benefits, right? And then, of course, if you have something like in the context of Croatia, we did this index of multiple deprivation, and what it's interesting about it is precisely because it shows that, you can have high poverty regions that actually might have very low index of multiple deprivation because they have infrastructure, they have economic potential, they have people that could work, but maybe there's something there that is lacking that is going to be very different from a high poverty municipality that doesn't have any of those things, right? And I think the granularity and a more fuller and better understanding of what is needed in order to basically really influence change is certainly possible, especially as we start to augment and complement this kind of information with additional context and data, which, in many countries, I think it is possible to do. Now, regarding the Brazil scenario, just to clarify, what hasn't changed is the spatial distribution of poverty. But let's make no mistake. I mean, during that period, poverty halved, right? So the poverty rate, right, went from 60 to 30. As per the national official poverty definition of the country. So there was a massive reduction in poverty. There was a massive reduction, right? Basically from 50 million to 30 million people so 20 million people out of poverty, 30 million people out of poverty during those 20 years, right? So there's been a lot of progress. What hasn't changed is the spatial distribution. And that, I think, is the message that I think it's interesting for us to be thinking about it, right? Because, you could think about that, just kind of reflecting on the pension story, right? Do the elderly, when they stop getting pensions, do they move or not? They probably are not going to move, right? They're probably going to stay exactly where they were before. And if they were already close to the line when they had the pension, the moment they stop receiving the pension, they probably are not going to go anywhere else because they don't have an alternative, right? So one thing that it's important to be thinking about it, yes, the poverty rate will change, right? But where they are might not. And one exercise that can be done, given, is that we could do in Latvia the poverty rate, right, with pensions and without pensions. And you can identify basically what are the hot spots, what are the areas, what are the geographic areas using the small area estimation approach, right, which are at high risk of poverty because of changes in the pension system, right? I'm sure you guys have thought about that, but it is something that could be easily done within this framework. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
I talk too much, so just tell me to shut up.
Yeah, we'll move on. We'll move on to the next speaker, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions at the end as well.
And we can talk in the coffee break, and tomorrow I'll be happy to talk more.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Azevedo. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Martin Šliberts from the Central Statistical Bureau, and he will be talking about the estimation and preliminary results of poverty mapping for Latvia. Please, Mr. Šliberts.
Oh, hello everybody. So my name is Martin Šliberts and I represent Central Statistical Bureau of Latvia. Thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me to give this speech. That's a pleasure for me. And actually I have to give a credit to my ex-colleague Martin Šmigelnieks. He has the same first name, so but he is not working anymore in our office. But basically, all of the results, what I'm going to present today, are done by my ex-colleague Martin Šmigelnieks. So I'm giving credit to him. Okay, so for today, this is my aim, what I'm going to present today. So I will start with some brief history about how the small area estimation has evolved in Latvia. Well, I mean in statistics Latvia, actually, to be concrete. And then I will show you some preliminary estimates and results, what we have done till far. And hopefully some conclusions at the end. All right, so let's begin. So the history of small area estimation in statistics Latvia looks something like that. And I will explain what do these numbers mean. Everything started with small area estimation conference, which actually was organized in Latvia, in Riga. Well, on the other side of the Daugava, to be honest, but it was a conference organized by the International Association of Survey Statistics, jointly with Central Statistical Bureau of Latvia and as well University of Latvia, the same university who has its premises where we are right now. And actually it was quite big conference. There was at least 100 participants and from 41 countries, and there were quite prominent speakers and experts taking part in this conference. And what else can I say? Some of the organizers actually are in this room as well. For example, Jānis Lapiņš over there, and Aija Žīgure, who were giving the opening speech as well. She was one of the organizers of this conference. Before the conference, actually, there was as well, I believe, very nice short course on small area estimation given by the Professor J.N.K. Rao. Of course, at that time, I wasn't interested in small area estimation, so I didn't take part in this conference, so I can't give you more details, but I believe during coffee break, maybe somebody can tell you something more. All right, but then, during these 11 years, actually, we were not working on small area estimation problematics. Well, it's not because we are lazy or we don't know how to do it, but actually it was because small area estimation was, at that time, was not priority for us, because during that time, priority was to get good national figures and to work on the sampling design and weighting and imputation to get good national and regional figures. And this was always our priority and not the small area estimation, because you have to choose what to do. And but things are changing. And because, of course, many of us who are working in statistical office, we knew about these methods, and we knew that we have actually the data available which would allow us to apply these methods. And so that's why we are always like thinking in background that maybe someday we will start to do this work as well. And yes, we used one opportunity in 2011 to invite very nice two speakers from the Statistics Italy to Latvia and to give us the so-called training on the job. So actually we had quite a good course, both theoretical part and as well practical part, where we tried to get some estimates for the unemployment rate by the local territories at that time. Yeah, so it was quite good experience, but still, even after this course, for the 3 years, nothing happened. Because still we had some other priorities to do, and those other priorities were much more important than small area estimation. And finally, in 2015, something really changed in this question. Of course, we are feeling that data users are acquiring more and more this more detailed statistics, and it's quite understandable from the point of data user that they want to know not just the big picture, but as well the small detailed picture. And of course, we feel that there is a need for this more detailed statistics. And yes, I mentioned already Martin Šmigelnieks, how it happened actually. It happened that he was a student that time, and he came to me and he asked, well, could it be that I could be his supervisor for his bachelor thesis? And I had some 3 topics in my mind which could be possible thesis. And one of the topics was the small R estimation, because I already knew Martin before, and I knew that he would be capable to do something in this area. And luckily, he chose this topic, small R estimation, to make it as his bachelor thesis, which is actually quite lucky. And yes, we worked during this something like half a year, a little bit more, on his bachelor thesis. But these were like our first steps really to do some smaller estimation and to try to joining this data and making these models and making some maps. And yeah, so it started like that. Meanwhile, at that time, actually in 2015, we got as well, smaller estimation, in some sense we can say during this year became like priority as well for us, because we got actually a budget that we could open a new position on our division in methodology department, that this position, this person would work on the development of the small R estimation techniques. And quite obvious, Martin Šmigelnieks was a very good candidate for this position, and he got the job. And after graduation, he started as well in our division, and he really started to work in the small R estimation development. Yep. And so basically at the beginning, somehow it was quite obvious that we will as well start to work with poverty mapping, because poverty always has been some kind of very hot topic, I can say, very important topic. And so that's why as well we chose that, okay, let's try as well to make some poverty estimation by the small areas in Latvia. So that's the introduction. And yes, of course, in 2016 as well, the project with the World Bank started. And I would say this project as well is some kind of driver for us, because we can follow a little bit what are you doing, and we have already seen quite a lot of information from your side, and of course it helps a lot, and to get some side from your experience. And as well, Martin took part in small R estimation conference in 2016 and presented some first results, what we achieved during that time. And yes, so the aim of our current research is that we want to estimate a risk poverty rate by the LAW2, or the local administrative territories. And yes, we chose the year 2011 just because we had a population census that year. And so we try to do this traditional way, to combining census data with the survey data. And okay, this is the map of the so-called direct estimates. These estimates are done using only EU Silk survey. This is what we could get if we would just take the EU Silk data and try to estimate what's the at-risk poverty rate by the LAW2 territories. But we see that this map doesn't show basically nothing, unfortunately, because there are at least 3 territories with a black color where we didn't have any respondent at all, so we don't have any estimate. And all other estimates are so variable from 0 till 0.8. So it's obvious that something error is huge over there, and there's no use of such map. This is a poor map, as we told, really. So we really need some kind of more advanced techniques. We can't get smaller estimates just using the survey data. So that's why we chose two additional data sources, and one is already mentioned the population census data from 2011, and as well we are lucky that we have available the data from the State Revenue Service available at the individual personal level. So we could use that data as well, and we thought that this should be quite good auxiliary information for the modeling. And yes, we took all the data corresponding to the 2011. So again, we are in good position that in all of these data files, we have the personal ID numbers available. And so it really made it quite easy to link these data. Basically, there were just some couple of cases which couldn't be linked just because the ID was not known or it wasn't valid, but for the most of the cases, it was possible just to link it just using the personal ID code, so we didn't have to use any fancy record linkage methods, and so that was easiest part for us. And so yes, I will just briefly I'll try to explain the process, and I'm not going into details today, but so at risk poverty rate is just a proportion of the persons below the poverty line as a poverty threshold. And what we thought that if we will be able to model the income corresponding to the EU SILC definitions for the all persons, then we'll be able to compute this at risk poverty rate for basically any territory or any other breakdown, to be honest. And so that's why we built the model for the income. So the income, the Y variable in our model was the income, what we're going to model. And so briefly, very briefly, in pictures it looks like that. So it's possible to merge the data records, and we can see the respondent from SILC survey, what was his registered income in a register, and what was his census variables. So it means that for this, for this part, this data we can use for the model. So here we have the income variables corresponding to the SILC definition, and we can take all the other variables as explanatory variables for the model, and we can build the model using this data. When we have the model available, then what we can do, we can actually estimate, we can get the model value, modeled income from our model for the whole population, because we have the registered data and census data for the whole population. And this represents the income coming from the model. And when you have this one, then we can compute a risk poverty rate for any breakdown. Of course, the big question is how good the model works, and can we believe this model? So that's the crucial part of for the smaller estimations. All right. Yeah, I had to put some formulas. I couldn't resist. But yeah, and there are some of the explanatory variables we were using in a model, and you can see that most of them are coming from the census, but some of them are from the State Revenue Service and incomes, benefits, and pensions. And now I will try to present some our first initial results, but actually during this presentation I will try as well to raise the questions what we are facing, because actually now I see this problem with the smaller estimation as a two-phase problem. One thing is to have this good model, good data, good model, and this is the one thing, mathematical thing. But another thing is, other problem is that how to communicate and disseminate these results so that they would not make some kind of misinterpretation, because this is a very high risk that we will publish some kind of table or map, and probably somebody will start to use it in a wrong way, because these tables are not so easy understandable anymore, because they are built on these models, and you have to take into account this this uncertainty, what there is in this data. So, and this is even more complex, actually, to be honest, not just this modeling part. And so, here it is. This is one of the poverty maps what we have drawn using this applied methods. Hopefully, it's possible to see that this part is more red, darker red, meaning that there's a higher poverty, and these regions around the Riga, they are less, well, more like pink color, and they are less with a lower poverty rate. But there's already the first problem, what you can see, because using the same data, but just changing the color coding, it's quite easy to get a different story. Well, let's see. For example, now I have changed slightly the limits for the color coding. And okay, the big picture doesn't change. The Latgala region is more poor, and the region around Riga the poverty is lower. But if you look on the details, then you can probably make different story, to be honest. And we won't be happy if it will happen. And if you look even more, again, we can just make some changes in this color coding, and again, you can maybe find some other territories which has now changed this interval, and already somebody can draw different conclusions maybe. So this is what we try to avoid. Another example is that the so-called, the ranking problem. I'm just imagining, and I think Pedro already mentioned this problem, that if let's say, for example, if we will publish just a table with these estimates, so of course, these local administrations, they will start to compare, is my local territory better than the neighbor one or not, and how it's good compared to Riga, for example, because everybody is comparing maybe to Riga. But what we can see here, so there are 119 points, so because we have so many territories, and they are sorted by just the estimate of the statistical poverty rate. But this line, this vertical line, means the confidence interval. Yeah, so because it shows how precise is this estimate, the small r estimate, and we can see that there are still these errors. There are measurement errors available. So from this picture, actually, we can see only that okay, these territories are quite obvious under. They are lower the average poverty line, and those territories are quite sure they are over the average poverty threshold. But we can't really compare, let's say, this territory with this one, because there is no statistical significant difference between these areas. But what I have learned already today, actually, that these, I believe, these could be those cold spots, and those should be hot spots, right? If they are, I would need to add the confidence level as well for the average, I believe. But okay, we can discuss it. Yeah, okay. But the idea is that we can probably would be a better way how to communicate these results, and it would be quite dangerous just to publish a table without any explanation, and so. Probably this is the reason why we haven't yet actually published official publication about these results, because okay, even though we have results, we are still thinking what is the best strategy how to disseminate these results, and so that's why we are still keeping it under in a how you call it, in a desk, or yeah. Well, it's still not yet published officially. Yeah. Okay, and so finally. Yes, so the work is progress since 2015. I would say we are going just by small steps, and as I told already, Martin Schmigelnes, who started this work, he has, unfortunately for us, he has left our office and to the private sector. And well, there's Elvis, a new employee who has started to work with this problematic, but of course it will take time again to get back on tracks, and move on. But I believe that even though by the small steps we are still moving somewhere, and I believe that we will get some results as well ready for publication. And yes, so some of the results are available, but still we are thinking about the best strategy how to publish them. And yeah, because of those problems of them, how is the mapping the best way, or is it how to avoid the ranking problem, etc. And actually, I have one more conclusion, if I have time. I think I have. That actually, in the future in Latvia, I believe that, well, before you saw that you could publish these poverty maps on the year when you have a census. But actually, in the future, in Latvia, we are actually working right now very hard to move to the register-based census. So basically, in the future, I believe that we will be able to publish census results. So census results in some sense even every year, because we have the data available, and maybe not all the variables, but maybe it's enough with those variables, what do we have? So actually, from the point of data, actually, I think Latvia is very good position that because we have analysis data yearly with personal ID codes, and we can link them, and so I believe there is a potential, at least from the point of data. Yeah? Hopefully, we'll have as well potential to work on the methods, etc. Okay, so that's all from my side. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Libets. We have a little more time for questions. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was curious, so in the portion where you're talking about linking the different data sets together, did I understand correctly that you were linking the individual identifiers from the silk as well with information from the census and from the, okay, so that's very, that's great. I think it's quite rare to be able to do that. In most cases, people are using sort of the average localities levels. So it's really, I think, very, very interesting, and looking forward to talking with you more about that.
Yeah, in this case, we are very lucky that actually that EU Silk team, like Victor's, they are working on to get all the personal ID codes, because actually they are using as well MSC data for the survey. So that's why they need these personal ID codes already in the survey data. So yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's very exciting to see the progress that you're making. I think on the ranking, right? One thing to think about it as well is that when you're disseminating any of the results of the cell, do you present standard errors? You know,
for some main indicators, maybe.
My experience is that most, which is normal, right? I mean, it's we in most of the things that we are actually measuring in the statistical system, right? They do have confidence intervals, right? We rarely report them. Right? Rarely. For many reasons, for many good reasons from the point of view of communication, all of that. And they all have exactly the same problem as this. Now, I do take your point, which is what I mentioned earlier, that the big difference is that this is identifiable, right? Because it's different when you talk about, the poverty rate of women is X, and there's a confidence interval, but nobody, there's no name behind that woman, right? While this this is a municipality with a name and address, a constituency, and all of that, and from that point of view, it makes sense. But now, one thing that I've seen that it's also possible, but I think that to some extent, right? I think it is important not to overplay the confidence interval challenge, because it's something that we face in other areas as well, and has never stopped us, right? On the other hand, I do share that. It's a different animal because of the identification of the municipality. But one possibility is to do the rank on the lower bound, right? Instead of doing the rank on the point estimates, right? You do the rank in terms of the lower bound. So you at least make sure that you choose the direction of the error that you want to minimize,
right?
Right.
And what you think about it is that, look, there are bounds of intervals of confidence, and I wonder actually if you do the lower bound rank, how different it would be from. I mean, some of them clearly would re-rank.
It would be quite different.
They would be quite different, but this is something that you can actually see, right? And if you want to be very conservative, right, that could be one strategy, right, to communicate it in terms of, I mean, put just the bars without the point, right, and you rank by the lower bound. But I think but I think there's a lot of possibilities, and the hotspots it's a slightly different.
Yeah.
But in spirit it's something close, right? And for example, the work in Croatia that we do is that's why we focus in those that have a poverty rate above the median or below the median, right? We're because we know that everybody, that's kind of the typology that we are interested from a policy point of view. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm representing Ministry of Welfare as well. So I would like to thank you for your presentation and to see the first insight into the results. And we know what you've done all those years while you were not working with the small area estimation. You did actually a great job to make our administrative data so qualitative that we can do the other things as well, and which actually help us to move forward to make more qualitative this small area estimation as well. So I'm very proud with our Statistical Bureau of Latvia, and my question now is, if you are going to publish those data, and I hope you will do that, can you see also the history, more previous years, or this will be the starting point? And I'm asking this because of Latgala region, of course. We have quite huge investments in that region, and we are going to have those investments mainly to boost economical activity there. And it's very interesting to see, has a spatial distribution changed a bit or not? Mainly we already know that not much maybe, but still to see this. But then we need also the data, a bit previous data from previous year. Is it possible or not?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Of course, it will depend on the data, what we have available. And if we have the income data from the State Revenue Service, Viktor, do you know from which year we have the data? 2007, yeah? So theoretically, we could try, but...
It's okay, then it's starting point.
Well, I can't really answer this question right now because, as I told you, we start always with more simple cases, where you have the census and we have all the data. We haven't yet tried to do it on different years. And after this, when we will finish this one, I think we will try as well to think about how to expand it. Because of course we understand that you need the time series and something like that.
When is your first household budget survey, your APS?
The first one?
Well, yeah, you have one in the 90s?
1996, I guess?
You have a 1996 APS?
Yeah.
And you have a census in 91? 1990. So potentially you could do this on the HBS just to see.
Yeah. Well,
you could potentially do it on just for the sake of comparability. Did you have a population count in 95, or you just did the census?
No, we had a census in 2000.
2000.
Yeah.
And you had an HBS close to 2000.
Yeah, sure.
Right, and you have HBS every year.
Yep. Well, not anymore, but we had it, yeah.
But 2011, around 2011, you also had an HBS.
Yes.
So you could do at least in the consumption space,
right? Yeah.
2000, 2011. Now, is the new design of the HBS that you're going to do it every 5 years, or no HBS ever again?
Maranda, can you?
Sorry, or maybe that's
do we know it?
Question.
I just don't know.
Okay. So, so eventually, right, many countries do it every 5 years for the CPI rebate, like weights, right? at least, but you could,
Yeah.
you know, in 2020 there would be another one.
Well, of course, there are options. There are options to look and to try to find some data which are comparable over the time, and then, of course, we can try to do something. Yeah. So, but it's still not yet possible.
Okay, last question, then we'll go to coffee.
It's thank you for your very interesting presentation. I have comment about this historical fact. I want to add one more. It's 2012 because in the year when World Bank organized seminar for all Eastern European countries in case of poverty maps in Budapest. So yes, you have to, because it was the starting point in case of poverty mapping in East Europe. But we have a long way to move to this seminar after. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock. We've come to the time for the coffee break. Thank you for 2 very interesting, stimulating presentations. Everybody here can go and have some coffee. Everybody watching at home can have some coffee at home, and we'll be back in half an hour. Let's post on something.